Good evening, everybody, and welcome to World Now with Jim Falk, a program hosted by the World Affairs Council of Connecticut with the partnership of many World Affairs Councils and many other organizations recognized in our video on the credits. We appreciate your support, and now here's Jim.
Thanks so much, Megan. It is great to do another World Now. It seems like we haven't been together in a few weeks, and I couldn't be happier to have this program with James Graham Wilson. One thing I need to mention is that shortly after his book came out, probably there was a review in the Wall Street Journal just a week or two afterwards, and I received that day 2 emails from some of our listeners saying, "You got to track this guy down." And then what made me really happy was to see that he is a graduate of the University of Virginia. Thus, the reason for my tie. James, I forgive you for not wearing one tonight, but it is great to share the University of Virginia in our background. Let me mention that James is participating tonight in his personal capacity and is not representing the Department of State or any government agency. So that way we'll get a lot more information, I hope. James has been with the Department of State in the Office of the Historian for some 13 years. His title now is Supervisory Historian, and this is his second book, America's Cold Warrior. His first book was The Triumph of Improvisation, Gorbachev's Adaptability, Reagan's Engagement, and the End of the Cold War. So, James, really wonderful to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
I should note that today is the 20th anniversary of the memorial service of Paul Nitze, which was at the National Cathedral. He died, I believe, on the 21st, I think, of pneumonia. So it's a little bit of a tribute that we talk about him tonight.
Yeah.
So, what is the office of the Historian at the Department of State? Are you a Foreign Service officer, or is it a civil service appointment?
I'm a civil service appointee, and well, I'm in the civil service. And the Office of the Historian is charged with producing the Foreign Relations of the United States series, which we commonly call FRUS. And all these volumes are available at history.state.gov. And what I do basically is, and what we do, we are tasked to provide a thorough, accurate, and reliable account of U.S. foreign relations. And when I was finishing up at the University of Virginia in 2011, I got hired to do some of the volumes on U.S.-Soviet relations and arms control during the Ronald Reagan administration. And that was fortuitous because it was what my dissertation was on. And so, we have statutory access to all government records of any classification, 25 years and older. And we go through them and we curate them and say, this should go in this particular volume, do some light annotation. And then it goes through a very elaborate interagency declassification process. And we can sometimes kind of sit down with folks at CIA or DOD and try to explain what we're looking for and, talk them through. And, the ultimate result goes on our website. And I hope that it's helpful for policymakers, but most importantly for, the American public. And in some countries, we find a lot of interest in other countries in their own history based on what the US is releasing about them, let's say in Argentina in the 1970s, and they're learning things about their own country. And sometimes in the present situation, it's not so easy to do that.
And you said you're typically working 25 years after the event?
Yeah, so I have, I'm kind of jumping around now between the Clinton administration and starting to work on the George W. Bush administration. But in the next few months, we'll have a couple volumes I worked on, one covering the second Reagan administration, national security policy, and then the other, the kind of second half of the strategic arms reduction treaty covering the George H.W. Bush administration.
Have you done Iran-Contra yet?
My colleague has done a draft of Iran-Contra, and I've looked at some of it. It's extremely interesting, and I'm happy to talk a lot, about that. I did a volume called Organization and Management for the Reagan administration, And Iran-Contra plays into that quite importantly. And there's one thing that I'll say that some people may not know, but when Bud McFarlane stepped down as National Security Advisor in 1985, he asked his successor, John Poindexter, if he could keep the email connection at his house, between his house and the NSC. And Poindexter, regrettably, and he acknowledges this was a mistake, said yes. And it was really that allowed McFarlane to stay in touch with LA North, and that's really got into trouble going to Iran in 1986.
Huh.
So really
one thing I forgot to mention was, please submit your questions, and I like to work them throughout the conversation. And please remember as well not to put them in the chat area, but to put them in the Q&A part of the Zoom. Before we get to Paul Nitze, you and I talked a few weeks ago about Max Boot's wonderful book.
Yeah.
Where it does go into some detail about Iran-Contra. Do you feel that President Reagan really understood what was going on?
I think that his motivation was to get American hostages back. And I think that was a noble intention. The hostages taken in Lebanon, and he thought that, if there was some way of getting the Iranians to facilitate that, that he was for that. And, he said, well, the American people will understand. Now, I think as a consequence of his really laid back oversight of some of the things going on within his administration, elements therein really kind of spun out of control. And in terms of the connection with Central America and the siphoning of funds, again, it was very lax oversight. And some of the people working on that, well, LA North above all, really on the organization chart for the National Security Council had no business working on that topic. So, all this is to say that, yes, stronger oversight would have been a good thing. I must say, I would like to say just quickly, though, that I think one of the things that I at least observe about Iran-Contra that I don't think is gets a lot of attention is that there's a kind of test of executive authority, especially when it comes to covert actions, which and after 9/11 we live in a sort of a dark world of counterterrorism. But the way I see the aftermath of the Iran-Contra revelations and through working on this organization and management volume is that there's a kind of challenge to executive authority that ultimately is the executive branch prevails, rightly or wrongly. I think that, some of the elements, for instance, even in Dick Cheney, who was then in the House of Representatives, he writes a minority report that later critics of Dick Cheney say, well, this is totally off the wall, but I'm not so sure that he got it wrong in some of the elements. But anyway, I mean, that's something that I hope will come out in this volume when it's released.
Well, we'll have you back to talk about that.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the book.
Yeah.
Paul Nitze really had a very privileged background, and I wonder if you might take a minute or two to talk about his early childhood, because he certainly had a privileged life in the beginning, really throughout. But
yes, his father was a professor at the University of Chicago, and before that at other institutions was a renowned philologist, an expert on Romance languages. And as a result of that, Nitze grew up, he attended the University of Chicago lab school. He sat next to, I can't remember if it was Leopold or Loeb, one of the two sat next to him at the school. He sort of had the option of going to the University of Chicago at age 16. Instead, he goes to, an elite prep school for a couple of years on the East Coast. He thought he would go to Yale. He wound up going to Harvard. And he was never a particularly motivated student. And
that's an understatement from what you wrote about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he tries to turn it around his senior year, but I don't know how, it's a gentlemanly C. He was receiving. I think that in ways I try to articulate in the book, the sense of privilege kicks in the sense that after college, he is looking for things to do. And I think based on some of his family friends, he kind of has entry to meet with people in the banking world, and that they send him to Europe. They say, go write a report on Germany. I understand you have some German heritage, you speak German, give me your report on whether a recession is coming. And
now, when was this? Give us the year.
This is in the mid 1920s. I'm, exact year escapes me at the moment, but it basically culminates with his coming under the wing of Clarence Dillon of Dillon Reed. And he has, as I try to say in the book, this kind of sense that Mr. Dillon is a almost larger than life figure. He tells him that there's going to be a great stock market crash, and a couple of days later there is, and then he very calmly kind of talks Nitze through what to do, and they work on these deals that, as he says at one point, they were all very disappointed by the establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission under FDR, because it made things less fun. They were doing all sorts of, I think shady might be a fair word to describe some of it. But he was having a great time. I think that in a point that's important about him is that he makes a lot of money. The real wealth comes through some of his own ventures. And certainly it helped that his sister married Walter Pepke, who was, a captain of industry, and that his wife is the daughter of basically an heir to, the Standard Oil fortune. And so, but he takes great risks. He's comfortable investing his own money in things, and he's comfortable kind of speaking up in meetings of very high octane individuals.
And I was surprised to learn that just down the road here from Santa Fe is Aspen, Colorado.
Yeah.
And he was an early investor in that and continued to go to Aspen.
This is a little bit later, in I think the late 1940s. He and his brother-in-law Walter Pepke invest in the land that becomes Aspen. They had a kind of connection. He had a connection to it before, because the father would take the family to elsewhere in Colorado as a sort of summer sojourn, and that I think was very important to Nitze, kind of in terms of how we might understand his longevity, is that he kind of built that into a schedule, that you needed to go into the woods every so often to recover.
What motivated him, given that he had a successful career in investment banking, to enter government, or to be around government and to work with government? I'm not sure if he truly entered government at that early age, but
he was very much a mentee of James Forrestal, who was a few years older and worked for Dillon Reed. And there was a moment sort of leading up to a year or so before Pearl Harbor, where President Roosevelt had decided that the United States needed to prepare to actively enter the war at some point. And I think that's well established by this point. And he wanted to kind of make nice with Wall Street. And so he courted James Forrestal, who I believe was a big D Democrat, but a kind of skeptic sometimes of the New Deal. But he asked Forrestal to come down to DC to help him. And Forrestal sends a telegram or whatever to Nitze, says, be in DC by Monday. And Nitze came, and he never left. He works a variety of jobs. He encounters people that we've heard of, George Marshall, Nelson Rockefeller, all sorts of people around around DC during World War II. But he's never in combat. He pick up arms, but that really didn't stop him from, again, being very confident in his policy prescriptions and saying this is what we should do in matters of war and peace.
And one of the things that's so interesting about him is his longevity. And was he agnostic about political party affiliation?
So his time in New York City, he's very dubious of political partisanship. I mean, he sees basically it was a big D Democratic machine that ran New York City, and he's just was very skeptical of all that. He himself was a registered Democrat. His wife was the daughter of a moderate Republican congresswoman who I believe lost in 1932 when FDR comes in. He, nominally, he states that because of the 1937 FDR court packing, he changes his registration to Republican. So he's a Republican during the FDR administration, during the Truman administration. And then in 1952, as he puts it, he's so put off by a speech that Dwight Eisenhower makes that he changes his registration back to Democrat. Then when Eisenhower comes in, he is expecting to receive a big job. He's offered a big job that's later withdrawn, and he's very upset because of that. So, I mean, it's a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, he didn't change his registration again after 1952, but he I think was associated through the 50s with being a potential Secretary of Defense in a Democratic administration. But I think that to his credit, he viewed the matters he was working on as above partisan politics.
Let's talk about his keen desire to be successful and, as you say, to be a man of action. He thought about academia, but not too long, not for a long time.
There's various ways of approaching this, and my answer to this and his relationship with his dad was something to be explored. I'm a child of academia. My father is a atonal classical composer, is retired longtime professor. So I guess it speaks to me. But he thought, and he wrote and said that the people around his father when he was growing up, were the smartest people in the world, but they had absolutely no clout over matters such as the 1919 Treaty of Paris Peace Conference. And that's where I think then his encountering somebody like Clarence Dillon was sort of what he was looking for. Here is a man of action. And now, a few years after that, he kind of has second thoughts, and he starts a PhD program in sociology at Harvard, which he never finishes. But if you go to the Nitze school, now they've moved it now to the old museum, but in the old facility where there was a royal portrait of him, he's wearing sort of the Harvard gown of a PhD. You could have a whole field day writing about his relationship with academia. But I mean, here's sort of the more important point, which I try to make in the book, and that's that when it came to nuclear weapons, you had theorists in academia, you had people at think tanks like Tom Schelling straddling both lines, who were writing about theories of deterrence and the implementation or the use of possible use of nuclear weapons. And I try to say in the book that none of those people had actually any more insight to the role of nuclear weapons in foreign affairs and what deters and what kind of puts us on a spiral model. Not that Nitze's insights were better, but that the theorists and people in academia, that theirs were no better than what he had, having experienced firsthand some of these things.
Well, one of the things you write about in the book is that because of his really unique knowledge of being able to combine politics, sociology, theoretical mathematics, physics, he had a seat at the table that lots of other people couldn't hold. And I wonder, how did he develop this very keen knowledge on nuclear weaponry?
Well, he was not aware, he was not involved, important to say that not involved in the Manhattan Project. He had no knowledge of it. Although, I mean, I think in retrospect, because he was involved in some of the strategic mineral acquisitions, he said, well, I did wonder why we needed all this or that thing. But it does, your question, I think the answer dovetails with his work on the strategic bombing survey, which the first part, while working in Europe, it was sort of real time, how do you improve the kind of the payoff, this is putting it very clinically and sort of inhumanly, but the sort of going after the German war machine as our losses and their losses is really amounting to anything in terms of our strategic bombing. But it's, to me, sort of even more interesting, I think, is his role in the second iteration of that, where Harry Truman, after Japan surrenders in 1945, most of the people in the first iteration go back to their old jobs because they think the war is over, which obviously it was. Nitze stays on, and he plays a much more kind of comprehensive role in the strategic bombing survey, looking backward at the United States and Japan. And so he travels to Hiroshima, a few months after the dropping of the bomb. So we can always say forever after, I've been there, I know what it's like. And he kind of tries to rationalize, the meaning of the atomic age. And his kind of basic takeaway, as I try to say in the book, was that the atomic bomb was unnecessary. I try to say, people have sometimes picked up on this as saying, well, look, Paul Nitze said we didn't need to drop the bomb, so therefore we didn't need to drop the bomb. I try to make the point in the book that he had tried to kind of advocate for an alternative bombing strategy a year previously, and so with part he was just kind of self-congratulating himself. But I think the more important thing here, in terms of the role of nuclear weapons and in the Cold War and how Nitze gets into it, is that he determines in the strategic bombing survey that the reason why Japan attacked in the first place at Pearl Harbor is because the United States had let down its strength, and never again could the United States allow this to happen. And in the first few years of the Cold War, and particularly when Korea breaks out in 1950, there was active consideration of, like, at what point would we use atomic weapons? Would we use atomic weapons against China after China intervenes? And Nitze, then in 1950, is the head of policy planning, and it's I think a more prominent role then than now, in the sense that he could convene the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is not something that really happens now for a long time. But they did discuss plans for using atomic weapons, and again, Nitze could say forever after, I went through all the options, and he was a great devotee of saying you need to apply pincers to a problem, or you need to kind of have a logic chain whereby you can clinically make a decision of what to do. And that's sort of his framework that he applied to all problems.
Well, you mentioned 1950, and so that gets us into the NSC 68,
Yeah.
which I gather now is getting a lot again attention as we're entering, as David Sanger would say, new Cold Wars. Tell us about the process. He was not the lead, I guess, but he was one of the, or was he the lead but one of the drafters? How did this all come about?
Well, so let me go with that in part. So the fall of 1949, you have a truly unfortunate confluent of events from the perspective of the United States and the world. We receive information, verifiable information, that the Soviets have detonated an atomic device.
Mm-hmm.
And around that time, the nationalist government in China falls to Mao Zedong, and you now have, China has gone communist. And there's a kind of then a debate internally where should we pursue research into a potential thermonuclear device, which would be exponentially more powerful than atomic bomb. Dean Acheson, then Secretary of State, delegates Paul Nitze to basically work on that proposal. And partly as a result of that, chooses him to succeed George Kennan, who steps down as head of policy planning. Harry Truman, when presented with the kind of pros and cons of pursuing a thermonuclear device, it all boils down to his saying, "Can the Soviets do it?" And the answer is yes. And his response is, "Well, then we have to." So what becomes NSC 68, and it's simply 68 because it's like the 68th paper that they signed off on. The NSA then did not have much of a staff, so they delegated this type of paperwork for the policy planning staff of the State Department. Nitze is the lead in kind of coming up with a study that addresses the fundamental question, what is the world going to look like in the thermonuclear era? And whereas George Kennan, as head of policy planning, had insisted on writing everything himself, Paul Nitze delegated this to a number of talented staffers. But the end result is very much reflected his ideas, and it was basically the United States is in a fundamental struggle between freedom and tyranny, and much of it is devoted to explaining why the Soviet Union is, as he called it, is their words, a slave state, and kind of much of it is then kind of trying to understand how we went from World War I to World War II, and then sort of how do you kind of incorporate into the post-World War II era? How do you re-articulate the documents, the founding American documents, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution? But the real takeaway is that we need to triple the defense budget after Harry Truman had pressed very hard for rapid demobilization after World War II. They're hitting the hammer over the head. And the then Secretary of Defense, Louis Johnson, had insisted to Truman that he would keep defense spending at about $13 billion. And, it's a massive change. And, then unlike, I think today, something would be kind of alien today is that, balancing the budget was seen as a moral act, as an act of good stewardship on the part of the president. And, Nitze was saying that that's silly. We can't let that stand in the way.
Yeah, I mean, he said it's okay if people pay more taxes. It's better to not have war.
Yes. Yeah. This is kind of opening up another theme throughout the book, which was that Paul Nitze never had to run for office, so
right.
He was vehemently in support of higher taxes, and so, that it was necessary. The United States was rich and could afford to pay much more.
And when you have investments in Aspen, et cetera, it's easier to take that position.
Yeah. But
let me ask you this: who was the audience for NSC 68? I assume it was classified.
It was classified at an extremely high level. Elements of it were marked restricted data, which was a kind of capricious thing. Restricted data under the Atomic Energy Act means kind of details about atomic weapons, and there's really nothing in there that fell into that category, but it was meant to keep it close hold within the US government. I think the immediate audience was the executive branch, to kind of instigate action. There was an understanding that the broad themes of it would inevitably leak, or people would, Washington newspapers would say, oh, there's this top secret study saying this or that and the other thing. But I mean, to your point, it was not declassified until 1975, and so it kind of acquired this almost mythic stature within the government and people who read or write about these things. But that's different than saying that it actually guided, U.S. actions in the 3 decades in between, 2.5.
So Nitze was part of in a sense, a club of very serious and well-known thinkers, from George Kennan to obviously Dulles and Acheson and later Kissinger. And yet, I think if you would ask a first year, a second year student of international affairs, they might not have Paul Nitze's name at the tip of their tongue while they would have Kennan and Kissinger. Why is that?
Well, with respect to George Kennan, so part of the reasons I got interested in this topic was about 10 years ago. I was at the Wilson Center here in DC. I was listening to a wonderful scholar named Frank Castigliola talk about George Kennan's diaries. And he kept saying about how, Kennan felt this way about Vietnam. He was very upset. And Kennan felt this way about the, INF, nuclear weapons deployment in the 1980s. He felt this way. He was very upset. And I kept thinking throughout hearing this that, there was one person who was actually in the room who was, telling presidents to do something, or even if he was not in the administration, people actually responded to his criticism, and they sometimes changed their mind. And, and that person, of course, was Paul Nitze. Kennan is much more famous, even though at that moment, when right before Nitze writes works on NSC 68, in January of 1950, Kennan leaves government. He goes back to his farm in New Jersey, and never again after that, I argue, is he command presidential attention. He's of no consequence to U.S. foreign policy decision making. Whereas Nitze remains consequential from that moment, 1950, to up until the early 1989. Kennan is more famous because he's a wonderful writer, and he wrote many great history books. He wrote very eloquently expressing regret about how, as he put it, his ideas were bastardized leading up to Vietnam. And Paul Nitze, and that's sort of, people like to hear that, people like to say, oh, well, they got it wrong. It's nice to know that the people express regret. And Nitze regretted nothing. He never said, I got this or this wrong, or anyone really got this wrong if I supported them. But I think he also was not as talented a writer, and he, certainly had he could have written a book through the 1950s that kind of cemented his reputation, but he chose not to. Maybe that was just fear of getting negative reviews. But I'll tell you one thing story that I think really articulates the difference between Nitze and Henry Kissinger, who is a household name. Henry Kissinger comes along in the 1950s and does basically everything Nitze does, but better. And they work together on a project for the Council on Foreign Relations, dealing with implications of Eisenhower's New Look strategy. And, from Nitze's perspective, Kissinger takes what everyone else on the panel, on the working group, study group did, and publishes a book under his own name. And so he sets down to write a very nasty review of Kissinger's book. And he sends it to, I think it was Foreign Affairs. Mm-hmm. And he receives word that Henry Kissinger has threatened to sue him if he publishes this. And Nitze sort of doesn't know how to, what this means. So he actually waters down the review. And here's the story that I think evokes the difference between the two men, is that the next time he sees Kissinger, and I won't do the accent here, but you can all hear the accent in saying this, that Kissinger says to him that the deal was that he would be allowed to write as many words as he wanted in response, and he got up to writing page 156, and he decided that it wasn't worth it. And
ouch.
Yeah, but there you have the kind of the humor to diffuse the situation, the ability to do that I don't think Nitze had. I mean, Kissinger was undeniably funny. And then another part to it is, why was Henry Kissinger National Security Advisor and Secretary of State? Well, I mean, he was willing to flatter and kiss up to people that Paul Nitze simply thought was beneath him. He turned down the job of National Security Advisor when JFK offered to him in early 1961. I don't think it would have worked out very well, but
why did he do that?
Nitze thought it wasn't important. He thought it wasn't it was beneath his rank. Yeah, it's a
And
great
you never
question.
got the cabinet, the Secretary of Defense. And, when you
Yeah,
look at pictures, and I've done that in preparation for this, and you have some in your book, he certainly appears to be stern and dour. I mean, is
yeah,
that a fair assessment? And I guess
yeah,
I'll
yeah.
for a segue, he would get very close to getting the gold ring, the diamond ring, but then he would aggravate Jimmy Carter or JFK. And maybe you can talk about the situation with Cuban Missile Crisis and how Kennedy got a little frustrated.
So some of you, I think, have some. Most of you have some familiarity with the tapes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and here we are, very close to the um, days in October from 1962 in terms of the October 23rd. The Whatever you think of JFK, it's undeniable how just extremely polite he was in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, otherworldly, polite uh, to, I would say, everyone except Paul Nitze. I mean, the closest you get to him snapping is him saying to Nitze at one point, check it again, Paul. And that had to do with the kind of trying to understand the status of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, a very interesting, frightening element of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I've listened to that several times, and a number of times, and I thought, well, this man really did not like this other man, and it didn't
Tone
start
deaf.
this particular moment. Yeah.
What happened with Jimmy Carter? Because that's probably the closest he got to becoming Secretary of Defense.
So Nitze had been Deputy Secretary of Defense in 1967 and 1968, and he did not. An example of the non-flattery is when President Johnson calls him into the office, and by Nitze's telling, Johnson made him sit across the desk in the Oval Office and didn't acknowledge him and would just kind of make phone calls, go about his business. And every once in a while, he would peer over to see how Nitze was responding. Was he kind of in awe of this man? And again, for Nitze, that was not his kind of deal. He didn't thought that was beneath him. But he during the Nixon administration plays a very important role in the SALT negotiations and basically crafting the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty. And he is in line for a significant post in the next Democratic administration. Jimmy Carter summons him down to a meeting in Georgia in the summer of 1976. I think it's in Plains, Georgia, and my understanding, there was a long bus ride there during which Paul Nitze and the former Secretary of the Air Force, Harold Brown, got into a very heated argument in what was probably a very heated bus ride about an article that Brown had recently published about the nuclear balance. And so, things were already off to a bad start.
Mm.
Now, the actual meeting that followed, and all of this is in the notes. I think they're by Stu Eisenstadt. I'm not entirely certain, but they may be in his files at the Carter Library, where Jimmy Carter asks everyone around him, what do you think about my ideas of the nuclear balance with the Soviets? And most people say they're pretty good, Governor Carter. And then you get to page 3 or 4, and Paul Nitze says, I disagree with the vast majority of what's been said. And you can tell that there is a lack of connection between these two men. And then you can sort of fast forward to the first NSC meeting of the Carter administration, and Zbigniew Brzezinski and nearly everyone else who had been in the room at the meeting in Georgia is now in the room the White House, but not Paul Nitze.
Yeah, well, with all due respect to President Carter, I don't think he's known either for being having a great sense of humor, so I can imagine that they would not get along. David Goldberg asked this, and it's a good segue for us to start talking about President Reagan. Was Paul Nitze the driving force of the successful INF Treaty in 1987?
I think that Nitze and INF is complicated and interesting. As David Goldberg may know, so Nitze is in charge of the negotiations in the first iteration from late 81 to fall 83. Then there's a pause. And in that first iteration, though, Nitze has the same as Walk in the Woods in the summer of 1982, where he basically proposes, we will, rather than insisting that, the Soviets eliminate all SS-20s, we will have some, limited deployment of ground-launched cruise missiles and potentially Pershing 2s, so long as you have some kind of reciprocal withdrawal. And Nitze's motivation for that was that he saw what was happening in part of Western European allies, and the governments were falling over this perceived to be all or nothing hardline deal. And he thought there's got to be some compromise here. And one of the things I try to make in the book is that the Reagan administration actually, and Reagan himself, rather than just rejecting this outright, right, did kind of consider this. And what happened then was the Soviets got out before Reagan could respond and rejected it, before we could reject it. But I try to make the point that even in 1983, partially as a result of what Nitze was doing, Reagan is thinking more and more about, well, maybe we can have some kind of compromise solution. But it takes two to tango. Fast forwarding a little bit, to the second iteration from 85 to 87, I think that, I think Nitze was, I try to make the point that he's extremely important in putting forward something called the Monday package, which, gets at your other question about the SS-18s. It's basically like 3 paragraphs that sets forward how we can move from a world of strategic offensive forces to strategic defenses. And sort of embedded within that is a way to get at the questions of INF, but also to get at the most bedeviling thing, which is what to do about the Soviet SS-18 heavy missiles.
And we have another question from Ray Termini in Dallas, and he asks about Nitze's book, Tensions Between Opposites, which was published in 1993, and I guess goes back as well to a commencement speech that he gave for his son at the prep school Groton.
Yeah, I mean, I encourage folks who are interested to look back at this speech and that he gave to the son at Groton. It's not like most college or most high school commencement addresses. It was basically a self-congratulatory account of his role in the Truman administration, and then he talked a bit about Heraclitus, and that was it. But this theme of tension between opposites. So the short answer is I think it's a really interesting book. I like it a lot, even though I say in my own book that I don't think that it's something that's sort of assigned in political theory classes. And I don't know whether it should be, but there's a lot of interesting stuff in there and insights. The longer question is that, Nitze, again, was very envious of the reception to Henry Kissinger's memoir project, which is, even Nitze was aided by people like Peter Rodman, but still it's an incredible kind of combination of memoir and sort of insights to, a theory of how the world works. And starting in the early 1980s, even before he was appointed to the INF, as INF negotiator, Nitze set about working on a huge book project that was supposed to be a combination of kind of both reflecting on his own time in government, but also putting forward this kind of theory of everything, which he kind of pinpointed his first initial interest in tension between opposites. And so at the Library of Congress, you can kind of see the readouts of the meetings between Nitze and his team. And you can also see when he's meeting with his editors and they're telling him, you've got to cut hundreds of pages of here. And his response is not very favorable. But I think that basically after the memoir came out from Glasnost to Hiroshima to Glasnost, he then a few years later writes this tension between opposites, which was supposed to be kind of the theory portion that he felt that he had to drop from the initial memoir. But I think it also contains a really, interesting portrait, particularly of people that he really liked: Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, George Marshall, and George Shultz. I mean, people who are really, admirable human beings that I think everyone should be more aware of today.
I want to be sure we have time to talk about the SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies. As you know, World Affairs Councils are always looking for great speakers, and a large number of them come from SAIS. And I've walked by the school lots of times, and I always just thought, oh, somebody gave this name in honor of Paul Nitze. I did not realize that he was the founder. And talk about what he really, and he and former Secretary of State Herter really were trying to accomplish.
Well, people from SAIS, my friend Hal Brands loves to point out that Christian Herter really took the lead in the early years. So Christian Herter and Paul Nitze were related by, I think I think that their wives were cousins, or there's some kind of relationship. And they lived together, roomed together at various points in World War II. And they came sort of over breakfast or something, came up with this idea: we need to start a school for policymakers. And in part, that was a consequence of particularly Nitze's feeling that the State Department was totally inadequate during this period, early 1940s, totally inadequate in terms of dealing with the types of challenges of wartime environment and what would inevitably come afterwards. And that in here, I think it's kind of interesting that he didn't necessarily think that government could come up with a kind of cadre of people who could do that. That Nitze thought that maybe the best thing we should do is to have, big U.S. companies, whether it's IBM or Standard Oil, whatever it was called then, who would kind of send their best and brightest to this school for a year or two before going out into the world, and they would have exposure to history, political science, hard economics, that would allow them to kind of conduct the types of engagement that the country needed in World War II and afterwards. And then meanwhile, these companies would then give an endowment to build up SAIS. Now, this latter part was the stumbling block, right? Because companies didn't want to give their best people, they wanted to send them out to the world immediately. So, as Nitze is working in the Truman administration, Herter is, kind of working on building this school. Christian Herter then, congressman, goes back to run for governor of Massachusetts, and they kind of switch off when, during the Eisenhower administration, Nitze goes back to build up SAIS. And, in some sense that he's not entirely, I think, honest with himself about SAIS, what SAIS was to him in the 1950s in the Eisenhower administration, because he keeps saying that it's not supposed to be a policy planning staff in exile. But even though he's building up the school, which is basically relying on the GI Bill for tuitions, he's also doing contract work for various entities, for the Congress, sometimes for the State Department, and sometimes for the CIA. He was they retained his clearances. He had a kind of a contract with them, and I also try to make the case that Nitze, even though he's critical of Eisenhower publicly, he is in some sense still working for the government in a limited role, and that becomes a kind of model for many people that come who they may be critical of a particular administration, but they're still involved in committees that involve security clearance.
So at that time when SAIS in part was operating as a think tank, did it have a leaning towards Democrats or Republican?
I don't think it has a particularly partisan bent, but probably more, in the 50s when he brings people back from policy planning, certainly they were more Democrats. His very good friend Charles Burton Marshall, I have no sense of his political ideologies. And then, in the 1970s, a lot of them, the people around him, become members of the Committee on the Present Danger, which were very critical of the Carter administration, but still many of them nominally Democrats. So at a certain point, you kind of lose track of
Right.
how some of these self labels would really stand up today.
Well, I'm holding an article that is written by Theodore Bunzel that was in Foreign Policy. And one of our viewers asked this question. Nitze spent the earlier part of his career pushing to increase our nuclear stockpile and the end of it almost backtracking with arms control negotiations. How can we avoid falling into a similar trap today, but still be able to defend ourselves? And the title of this article is The Return of Paul Nitze and His Dangers.
In the last 10 years or 15 years or so, that this is no great insight, but the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation have focused on modernizing, upgrading their nuclear forces, and that's not sort of been a priority for the United States government for various reasons. And I say this not because I think that we need to kind of build tons of nukes to keep people at bay, but I think that it's a kind of an insurance policy that we really don't have. I'm less inclined to kind of believe in the idea that we can just get rid of nuclear weapons, or that we can negotiate toward that end. And I think that even though Paul Nitze by the late 1990s kind of started saying that we should just abolish all nuclear weapons, there's no point in them at all. Unfortunately, I think it's a much different sort of global landscape. Where I do think that there's room for optimism here is that he, wrote an article in, I think, 1976, talking about how we can potentially achieve strategic stability, which is a term that basically means no one side can fear a surprise or first attack from another. And I think it's possible to structure nuclear forces in a manner that can convey that. It's a much more difficult situation now with a sort of three-body problem with China, Russia, and the United States that Nitze didn't face in the Cold War.
I had the opportunity last night to be with General McMaster at a program at the World Affairs Council of Colorado Springs, and he said, this is McMaster, you cannot have a strong defense without a strong offense, and talked a lot about how you message to the American public a need now to increase the defense budget. And that gets to two questions that are about the same. One again from Mr. Termini and one from an anonymous attendee. What advice would you give to the next president? And what advice would Paul Nitze offer the president on how to deal with Iran and its proxies? And we have about another 2 or 3 minutes. You can combine those.
Well, Paul Nitze, I try to make the case in the book from 1969 onward, really was singularly focused on nuclear weapons, and he kind of put aside such topics as, I guess we would today say Iran as proxies, so I would kind of point back to his earlier work in the late 1940s, which is that we need to think about whatever we call the new Cold War as a global stage, and that he, unlike Kennan, would cede no particular sphere. And so, wherever countries that oppose the United States and its allies, wherever they operate, we need to be strong in those theaters. So I do think he would be quite hawkish on Iran as proxies and his earlier iterations. In terms of advising the next president, we touched on this before. he would be appalled by the idea of, cutting taxes, or just anything other than raising taxes, or finding some way to kind of have a shared sacrifice to deal with these very, very complicated and dangerous threats that the country faces.
James, where did he stand on the expansion of NATO?
He was against it. He signed on to the letter in the mid-1990s, and various people have pointed this out to me or reminded me of this. He signed on to the letter with George Kennan and others. I mean, Richard Pipes and others. But I do think it's hard. It's hard, sort of hard to look at that moment in the mid-1990s and say, well, what he then say was everything could be blamed on the expansion of NATO and
right.
Obfuscate,
There would not be a walk in the woods probably today.
I think to the point of what I think you're getting at here, I think okay. Well, I think that the best we can hope for is to take elements of plans from the Cold War that have kind of reduced tensions, increased strategic stability, and that's sort of apart from, okay, there's going to be a kind of off the record secret agreement that allows that to happen.
Right. This is a really interesting question from Greg Gosek. Did Nitze, through his involvement with the Team B 1970s analysis of Soviet military capabilities that proved to be exaggerated, have a direct connection to the deterioration of the U.S. public finance and deficit spending?
I don't agree with that, the premise. So the first part, I don't. So I guess I would say that the capabilities were not greatly exaggerated. It was the consequences of those capabilities and the intentions emboldened by those capabilities that proved to be wrong. And the second part of it, I think that, with it's sort of the long-term consequences of the Graham-Rudman Deficit Reduction Act in 85 and 86 that leads to, balanced budgets in the mid-1990s, for better or worse. And then, that falls apart after 9/11. So it's a very important question, but I don't see the kind of through line leading to kind of ever expanding deficit spending. Now you could, I think you could make the case to Greg Gosek that it's the kind of the spirit of NSC 68, which is revived after 9/11. I think you could make that case that has led to ever expanding deficit spending. I think that would be a more valid takeaway, I think.
Well, James, Dr. Wilson, UVA grad, I want to thank you so much for taking time to be with us, and I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners. And I think I can honestly say we barely scratched the surface. In the book, you do such a nice job of including memos and some of your good research. And I think you've encouraged all of us to go look up the State Department documents, even if they're 25 years in the background. I'm dying to read more about the Iran-Contra affair. So thank you very much, James. And thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on our next program. As I mentioned, I was with General McMaster, and he is looking forward to being on WorldNow, and we're just firming up a date early in the next year. Enjoy the rest of your evening. See you next time.